Actually, I'd like to start by thanking Bernadine for this amazing seminar, which she's curated, and selecting such a fantastic group of writers, and for also selecting such an interesting theme for this seminar and this panel, writing about gender, feminism, masculinity, and sexuality. I mean, I've certainly been gripped by all the sessions so far. And of course, it's so, as I said last night, incredibly topical with the Me Too campaign, the fourth wave of feminism, and this very, very vigorous discussion that we're having at the moment about gender and to what extent is it biologically or socially determined, and then this whole new language evolving, a sort of lexicon of new words. I mean, I have to confess that, when the phrase cisgender first came up, I was too embarrassed to sort of say that I didn't really know. I mean, I kind of figured out I knew what it meant, but I secretly went away and Googled it after a panel, And in case you don't know the official definition, it is denoting or relating to a person whose gender corresponds to their birth sex. That seems to be the general one, although when you look up, there are quite a few different definitions. And this whole issue of language can be a minefield, which I think we're all treading around very carefully, and that's something I think that will be interesting to discuss. And this is an excellent panel for this, because they all have very different perspectives. Juno, who you've just heard, from the sort of trans female perspective, but who's also written under the name of James Dawson, a man's name. Kerry Hudson, who's spoke last night, and most of you will have heard her talking from the perspective of a working class writer, but also identifying as queer and bisexual. Nick Makoha, who we haven't heard yet, but is, I think I can define you as a straight male poet. Is that all right? Yeah, okay. But one who has explored masculinity in his work. Sorry to give you all labels, but that's what this is kind of about, isn't it? In fact, let me start with you, Bernadine, because you wrote a blog ahead of this seminar in which you described attending a creative writing conference in the US, where you were asked to fill out from a tick box what gender you were, and you had 12 choices. So you talk us through, because that sort of led you onto the journey that finds us here today.
Yeah, so it was a very big, is this on? A very big creative writing conference in America, and you had to tick your gender, and there were 12 choices, and I was shocked. And it was the first time I kind of understood male, female, and trans, but I didn't really know that there were so many identities that you could define as. And so one of them was androgynous, cisgender was down there. I can't remember all the others. But I was shocked, and I remember posting about it. And, people were pitching in, and the Americans, I'm friends with on Facebook, were very familiar with it, most of them. But a lot of the British people weren't. So we were having this conversation about it, and then I looked into it further. And then, of course, I discovered, as some of you may know, that Facebook has something like 70-something official genders. And then I discovered, I think there are about 300 genders. And then I was looking at all the different versions of genders, and some of the genders are, you can have a gender that it changes throughout the day. So you start off feeling one thing, and then by the end of the day, you're something else. And, forgive me, Juno, because I don't know how you feel about this, but I was laughing, because I thought this was, I just thought, how can you have a gender that's constantly fluctuating from one minute to the next? Isn't that a state of mind or a mood or something? But then I thought, well, this is kind of an extreme version of what happens when people self-define according to their gender. And I still find that very strange. But, so that aspect of it, I'm not sure about. But in terms of sort of people's male to female, female to male transition, I feel that I have a deeper understanding of it now. And in the new novel that I've been working on, I have a character who defines as non-binary. And I have many, many women in this novel, and I thought I have to engage with this subject. So I have a character who grows up as female and then eventually goes on this journey and decides that she's non-binary. And to me, that really made sense, that somebody would choose to do away with gender altogether. So it's very interesting trying to write from that perspective, and also to use the personal pronoun of they, which has been very, very hard to write, because I'm used to it being used in another way. So that was the beginning of my kind of
Can you just define,
journey.
I mean, what defines non-binary, since we're going
Someone
to the
who doesn't identify as male or female.
I mean, do you,
Yes.
yeah. You always chose to identify as she. You never went down the they route.
No, I mean, I think for really interesting person to speak about this is C.N. Lester, who is another writer who wrote a fantastic book called Trans Like Me, and They Are They, and C.N. doesn't use the phrase non-binary because they feel it has created a new binary. So you are either binary or non-binary. So it's become curiously binary. So CN uses genderqueer or gender fluid. CN feels they are neither male nor female, and that's where they best are. It was CN started down a more traditional transgender route and went part of the way down the route, and then realised that they were happy where they were, sort of existing somewhere between a notion of male and female, and that was what worked for them.
And do you, just to pick up on that point that Bernadine made earlier about, can you be several different genders within a day?
I can't. And I don't know about anybody else. Obviously, because this is the very thing. I was on Good Morning Britain. Oh, you Germans, you don't get this daily treat of Piers Morgan. Imagine having to look at that over your breakfast every day. Yeah, so I was on Good Morning Britain because Piers has this bizarre bee in his bonnet about non-binary identities. I mean, just marry one. I mean, he's obsessed. It's all he thinks about, Trump and big non-binary people. And I sort of went on and had to explain that I'm not non-binary, and that confused him. I think he thought it was a new word for being trans. And I was like, no, you need to understand that I'm a woman, and I very much subscribe to being a woman. And even he looked a bit bewildered. But, his bee in the bonnet was about the Facebook identities as well. And, he had a popper. He said, oh, these two spirits. Well, that's a load of old nonsense. And I was like, hold the fucking phone. Because, the Native American concept of the two-spirit people has been around for, as far as we know, about 1,000 years. So this isn't some newfangled Facebook innovation. This is because if we look at the Fa'afine, if we look at the Mahu of Hawaii, if we look at the Kathoe of Thailand, there have been lots of different ways of defining gender, historically and culturally. Sir Piers Morgan, step off your fucking privilege box and go eat a shit.
Yes, Piers Morgan, reasons for living in Germany. Number one. Nick, the three writers that we've heard from so far talking about their books, men have not come out well. So, are you feeling under attack? Are you?
No, I'm fine. No, I think the writers who come before have said some very important things. There is, you were talking, Juno, about this, at the center of the problem is this male white privilege and this world that we live in where, what did you call it, rape culture. And that's something to take seriously. So I am not white, so Just want you to know that.
Thanks. Yeah.
I do not have those privileges, and that is a serious thing to talk about. So, and that's what this is about. It's about privilege. It's about power. And I think we come off badly. I was talking to you just outside. Men come off badly because we shouldn't be in a world where women are still fighting for equality for simple things such as pay. It's a simple solution, and to pretend that it is not a simple solution, and the fact that people do not want to discuss their pay and make it equal and make it fair, that is the problem. So I don't have the power to change that, because if I was in power, that would be just sorted out. I said, let's get equal pay, boom, and then it's done. But they don't want to sort out that problem because there's something to gain. That's the question behind the question is, what is white privilege gaining in maintaining this power structure? You know, there is a lot to gain, and even with all this Weinstein stuff and all the sexual harassment, you know, the thing to get, I mean, I've been talking about this kind of behind closed doors, is that this culture, a lot of people have known about this culture. Harvey Weinstein wasn't this person yesterday, and he suddenly, you know, this is something that has been going on. He wasn't the first. He's just the one getting the flack. You know, this is a culture that's been going on for over 50 years, maybe even longer than that, you know, inside of the film industry. So as a man, what annoys me is that things that are known are allowed to carry on and perpetuate, and it's only when we get to this point of embarrassment that we take it seriously.
And what about the argument that is very often conducted behind closed doors, but since we're all being very open here today about what happens behind closed doors, but is that conversation that you often hear, particularly men having at the moment, saying, well, how do you negotiate sexual relationships, you know, in the wake of Me Too? You know, how can you even make a pass at a woman? And that's one of the arguments that you often hear, isn't it?
Trust me, I think we'll be making negotiations well into the future. I don't think that's going to be a problem. I just think it's now we have to have the conversations. So we can't just carry on as we did, you know, 100 days ago or 200 days ago, whenever this dropped. So what we have to do now is actually start, you know, asking, is, you know, we were talking downstairs, is how do we teach sexual health? Are we teaching it properly? You know, what do women actually need? What do men want? How do we talk to one another? Are we talking to each other in the right way? Now, if you're willing to have those conversations, then we can kind of move on, and then people can kind of let down their guard again, and we can start, you know, just being whatever gender we want to be, but interacting with each other as human beings, because humans need interaction. That's the important thing. You know, I can't live by myself. You know, I like alone time, but I can't live by myself. I need people around me. I need friends. I need lovers. I need, you know, and so on and so forth. But there is a way to treat people. There is a human kindness that needs to be present. And I think right now what's apparent is that human kindness is not being expressed. What is being expressed is a violence, power struggle, you know, things of that nature.
Yeah.
I think it's a certain kind of defensiveness that we experience when we talk about, for example, sexual harassment, that men will say, oh, I don't know, what can I do now? I can't talk to a woman, I can't chat her up because I'm going to be accused of sexual harassment. And it's a defensiveness, and it's a way of not really engaging with the subject, because, of course, any reasonable person will see that there are different gradations in terms of how you treat people in ways that are abusive or not. So, for example, physically touching somebody perhaps might be inappropriate, putting a hand on their knee, for example, if they don't want you to. Chatting them up and looking at their breasts, that might be considered... Sorry. Looking at their breasts, that might be considered harassment. But, and of course, we know that rape is, and so on and so forth. So I think... But when you say that, and I think even some of the sort of big celebrities who have said, look, we've got to distinguish between the different kinds of harassment, there's a kind of movement out there, you know, a sort of feminist, sort of mass voice of outrage, which is attacking anybody who questions the fact that we can't treat everything in the same way. So I think it's an interesting subject, and I think, you know, obviously, when people are first challenged in the way that, for example, men have been in a sort of mass way in terms of sexual harassment, I think the first response is a knee-jerk one, and some men, and defensiveness. And then we need to have the proper, sensible conversations.
Yeah, and I think actually going back to Nick, new definitions of masculinity, because that's what you tried to do in your book, Kingdom of Gravity, which is about Idi Amin, whose regime in Uganda personified the alpha male. And of course, you know, we see plenty of regimes like that at the moment, where entire societies are built around an alpha male. And you've talked about pulling back the curtain on that and seeing what lies behind the alpha male.
Yeah, I mean, if you look back at Uganda in the 1970s, I mean, if you talk to people about Uganda, what they know is Idi Amin. So what you know is this alpha male. But, you know, even in my research, I've recently been out there with, I'm working on a play also based around the book, but I went out there with my director, and when we were being given a tour, what you find is that actually there was more complexity to Idi Amin, which is nuanced. He was a created being, so he was the colonials kind of said, oh, let's get this dumb idiot to run the country, and we can run the country through him. And when he figured that out, he was like, no, I want to self-determine the country for my fellow Ugandans. But he wasn't literate enough. He wasn't confident enough in himself to ask for help. And what that perpetuated was this, you know, this alpha maleness inside of him. But, you know, what's that's left behind is people only relate to Uganda through this alpha male gaze. And there are people behind that. They are women, men, you know, who have different stories. And it's important that, you know, we, you know, even though I'm not your typical white male privileged man, I'm still a man, and I hold a lot of power in society, and I have to look at the way I tread through the earth, you know, especially as a married man, as a father to a daughter. I'm aware that things I say that just might seem soft in my perspective land heavy in maybe my wife or my daughter's ears. Do you understand? Sorry.
Well, of course, the other thing that Uganda's quite sort of notorious for is homophobia. And is that the flip side of that? I mean, does that go hand in hand also with the Idi Amin legacy, do you think?
I mean, I'm not a politician. I can't answer what I do know about it is that I think homophobia is just rife across the world. I don't think it's unique, particularly to Uganda. I think you know, we have. There are people in the world who cannot see the world beyond their point of view. Yeah, and they cannot accept people beyond what they were raised in. And, you know, I mean, you know, I don't think that's right. You know, you have to be able to look at people and see people for people. You know, just because I just see, you know, it's that kind of saying of the three blind people who saw an elephant. You only see the world through your eyes. And I think we need to, you know, just as we're talking about these debates, this is why we're having this conversation, we need to start seeing the world through many different eyes and piecing together a true representation of reality. Otherwise, we're just living in our own private prisons of truth, you know?
Kerry, I was interested last year, it's quite complicated handing around the mic. I was interested when you talked last night about your second novel, Thirst, which, for those of you who weren't here, is a love story between this outwardly quite masculine man, Dave, and this Russian woman, Elena, who's been sex trafficked. And you actually said that you had based Dave on a former female partner. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's also, I guess, because most of the time when I'm writing, I'm trying to understand my own life as well, even sort of when I'm writing fiction. But my female partner had lots of masculine qualities as well. But it was interesting, I think, to write two characters who did subvert those gender stereotypes. Elena is incredibly strong. She can be quite brutal. She's not necessarily a likable woman, which I was happy to write because I think that's kind of a taboo, that you can't have a woman who isn't immediately likable, who isn't a little bit manipulative, who isn't a little bit dark. And likewise, Dave was sort of he's sort of a South London council estate lad, and I wanted to show how much tenderness kind of, that sort of toxic masculinity idea, what is actually lying underneath that, because he looks like the big guy who look at Sun Page 3 and Wolf Whistle at Girls, and but he's got this this real sort of gentleness and tenderness, and I think it's interesting seeing those sort of subversions, and so that's what I was trying to do.
And I'm interested, because your comment just then about making Alina not a very nice person, almost deliberately, because Juno, you were sort of saying that earlier about writing a not nice woman. Perhaps you'd like to expand on that.
I think as well, I think sometimes that male characters are given, like a good example is Tyrion Lannister or Jaime Lannister, actually, in Game of Thrones. Neither of them are nice, and yet they're still allowed to be heroes. And rarely, I think, do we offer female characters that same sort of privilege, that you can be ambitious or greedy or ruthless. And I think you root for Lexi, and I'm sure you probably root for Alina as well. And I think you can root for a character and understand and admire a character without necessarily liking them. Whereas I think with Lexi, she is so self-depreciating that you slightly warm to her. But I mean, she says some outrageous things. She says some quite horrible stuff.
And do you want your readers nonetheless to root for her? Is that the way you've written it?
That was the challenge. It's kind of, I quite like, and I think I've reached that stage. I think Clean is my 7th novel. I'd reached the stage where I wanted to slightly play a game with my reader, like in the film Saw. We're going to play a game. And the game is, would they tolerate her behaviour? Because there's these glimmers, and there are little seeds that maybe there's more to her than meets the eye. And so the game I wanted to play was, will they stick with her, and I almost wanted to challenge the reader, could you forgive this person? Can you find it in yourself to forgive her? Because, of course, that's the question that Lexi's asking as well. She is riddled with guilt for something that happened to her a year ago. And so it's about both the reader forgiving her and also Lexi forgiving herself.
That's interesting, because guilt actually tends to be, don't you think, like a more female emotion? I mean, I'm a big Game of Thrones fan, so
let's just talk about Game of Thrones.
Let's just talk about that.
Out,
but
yeah.
Picking up on the two examples there of the Lannisters, they're completely ruthless. You're right, and we root for them, and it is more difficult. I mean, you see far fewer female characters who are ruthless, who you want to root for, because they're just bitches, aren't they?
Yeah,
they
become villainesses.
Yes, yeah. Sorry, now lost my. What is the question? So are you? Yeah. So you're trying to subvert that. You're trying to create that. But at the same time, you talk about her having guilt, which is very female. You wouldn't find the Lannisters feeling guilty, would you?
I don't know. I think guilt's quite universal. I think Macbeth is a good example. I mean, Lady Macbeth is an interesting character, of a female character who has all the promise in the world. And for me, she's one of the most fascinating characters in literature, because then she goes nowhere. She's like this amazing character who is ruthless and manipulative, and she kind of gets the job done when Macbeth kind of flakes out. And then in Act 2, she's like, oh man, I'm just gonna go off stage for a bit. And that's it, you never see her again. And you hear her screaming, oh, Macbeth, Macbeth, your wife has killed herself. He just didn't know how to finish that story. He'd created this female character and then just didn't know what to do with her. I'd like a word about Lady Macbeth with Shakespeare, but I think I've missed my chance. But I think that would, a guilty male character would be a fascinating study.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting question, because I think there is an expectation that female characters or protagonists should somehow be likable. I think I'm correct in saying that. Sorry? or
Submissive, yeah.
submissive. So the book that I'm working on at the moment, as I said, has all these multiple characters. And when I was revising it, I was thinking, because I think they're really interesting characters, right? And they're really flawed, and we know that characters have got to be flawed and so on and so forth. And I was thinking, but are they likable? And that wasn't something that I was thinking about as I was writing it. But then thinking about sending the book to my publisher and agent, I thought, do these characters have to be likable? And should I tone down some of their sort of spiky qualities? And I did just a little bit. Although I may kind of, spike them up a bit later on. I don't know. I'll see how they're received. But it's a question, I think, that we have to grapple with, as women, writers. Should we write, pleasing characters? And it was very interesting. We just had our photograph taken, all of us. And we were all smiling, apart from Nick. Nick was just looking. And that is a gender thing, I think, that as women, we're supposed to smile and show that we're friendly. And if I were to just go like that with my bitch face, right, people will say, what's wrong with her? But it's actually acceptable for a man to, so I think these are some of the issues we're dealing with.
Oh, Bernadine. No, I don't smile because when I smile, my eyes close and it looks ridiculous. So... But I want to add to what you're saying is that I think if human emotion is are the piano keys, I don't think in that kind of binary, as you were saying, that binary condition that we're in, we don't permit ourselves to feel all the emotions. So men are allowed to feel angry. We're allowed to, to at many extents, and it's seen as normal. And when women express that anger, she's not being woman-like. Do you see what I'm saying? Or women are, and there are many different complications of that. But what that ultimately means is, you're going through your body and there are parts of you that you can't fully express. And that's what creates the misunderstanding, and going back to that point of how do we now engage as in relationships, it becomes hard if you're not even allowed to fully express what you're truly feeling inside. So then that ambiguity will only lead down paths that will get you into trouble. And we have to start learning how and giving ourselves permission to express all the keys on the piano.
And I suppose, yeah, exactly, because I suppose the flip side of that is that, could you have a brave, hero, a Jamie Lannister, who cries? Yeah. So, two of my favorite people are my daughter and my son. And my son I've actually learned a lot from. So there are times when I've realized he's getting really frustrated. And actually what soothes him is says, do you need a hug? And he goes, yes, please, Daddy. Yeah? But if you ask adult men when they're in situations that they can't handle, you need a hug, they'll tell you, fuck off. But the opposite is true. And there are times when I actually realize, I mean, it was a stupid thing, but when Prince died, it broke my heart. And I was watching it, and my son was sitting down. I think he was playing Legos or something. But I just said to him, I need a hug. And I actually learned that behavior from my son, that ability to let your sadness out. Because I think men hold their sadness like it's a verruca or something. They want to hide it, I'm going to move on to another definition in the lexicon, and I'm going to come to you for this, Kerry. You define yourself as bisexual, queer. So let's talk about that word, queer. Why queer?
Because I really didn't want to get the shit you get for calling yourself bisexual. Be called slutty or indecisive or all of the things that Juno said. So for 10 years, I identified as lesbian. I was in a relationship with a woman. I didn't see that changing. When my first book came out, all my interviews said I was a lesbian. It was really fun undoing that identity, calling my publicist and saying, there's been a slight change of plan. But I learned really quickly that, and I had this amazing framework of incredible gay friends, you know, and lesbian friends. I had this like huge support network. It felt amazing. I felt very accepted. In workplaces, people could easily define me. So they were like, "Oh, you're lesbian. That's cool. That's so cool." You know, they, when you come out to people, and then I realized that my sexuality just wasn't that simple. Largely because I went on a sort of, I imagine, not quite as adventurous as Monique's adventures, but I went on, you know, sort of my own sort of sexual, I can't say sexual discovery on the stage, and now I have. But anyway, journey, thank you. I realized my sexuality was more fluid. And queer, I think, is for me, it's like, it's a sense of otherness, you know, is none of the above. And it allows me to do what the fuck I want, basically, and to fuck who I want. And I think that is my right. I know a lot of people, especially the older generation of lesbians and gay men and bisexuals find the term queer problematic. But for me, it is a reclamation, and it enables me to not feel that I have to be so binary, not be defined, not have people able to fit me into the box that they choose to, which I have to deal with all my life, you know?
I like queer as well, and I've been increasingly using it, despite the fact I only like having sex with men, because I love that there's an element of never say never, which I think I'm old enough now to know that that's a load of crap. But more than that as well, I mean, even in the very earliest days of my transition, I think my friends accepted me very, very quickly as a woman. They were great, and they've obviously known me forever, so I think they got it. But they were like, huh, so you're straight now? And I was like, and it didn't, because the vast majority of people in the world would identify as straight or heterosexual. I suddenly realized, but in my whole life, I'd never been in a majority group, really. Granted, I'd passed as a white man, but I'd never passed as a straight white man, ever. Like, from birth, everybody knew, like, my primary school teachers knew there was something amiss. We all just got it wrong, kind of. And so all of a sudden, it was like, well, you are now a white heterosexual woman. And I was like, okay. But it didn't feel, because of my transness, my transism, I don't think I'm ever going to belong to the majority group. And so I think queer for me is my way of saying, well, yes, this is me, but I think we have to acknowledge that I'm not in that majority group and that there's something afoot, something, you know, something else, and something very hard to define.
But it's interesting. I mean, Bernadine, I want to ask you this because for our generation, slightly older, it's an interesting word because it kind of. I mean, let's talk through the development of this because I mean, when we were younger, queer was quite insulting, wasn't it, or not?
I think it was. It was a pejorative term, wasn't it? Definitely. I don't know. I mean, I'm very open to all these new definitions, and I think I agree with Juno and Kerry that it's what works for you. And
but it's about. I'm just interested in. It's really interesting about sort of the reclaiming the language. It was there. It was. I think a term that. Well, particularly gay men, I think, used in the sort of 30s, 40s, 50s, didn't they? When homosexuality in Britain was illegal, as a and but then in the 60s and 70s, exactly, it became sort of because it had these associations with sin and illegality. It was rejected. And now it's come back as a positive thing. I think it's a really interesting evolution of language, actually. Yeah.
So, Dad, I had a really nice chat about queer with McCain, who's the editor of Attitude magazine in the UK, and the reason he knows he has to get on board with it because a lot of his readers use it. But for him, it was the word people used when they kicked the shit out of him when he was at school. And it's the same reason why I won't, even in a reclaimy word, use and I will use it now to illustrate, I will use tranny, because for a lot of trans women, especially of trans sex workers of colour, it's the last word they hear before they die. So I'm not going to be like, woohoo, tranny's here, because I think that is completely, you know, if I use it, it makes it okay for everybody else to use it, kind of. And I think there's a whole other conversation about reclaiming words, but I think queer is one that has been very successfully reclaimed, but that doesn't make it any nicer if that's the word you were bullied with at school. So my heart does go out to people like Matt as well.
Sorry, I know I'm not chairing this, but
No,
I'd
go
really
ahead.
like to ask Juno a question, which is, you know, there's a bit of a debate about women, feminists, not really accepting trans women as women in the way that they are women. Because they're saying, well, you know, you were, or you presented as male, you've lived a life as a male for however long of your life. Now, visually, you look female. You would say that you're conforming to what you always were, but they're saying we don't accept you. So could you perhaps speak to that? Because it's such a contentious issue, and when people do raise it, they get shot down, right? So Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie got shot down, Germaine Greer gets shot down, but it's a conversation I feel that we need to have.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say there's a world of difference between Greer and Chimamanda. Chimamanda was slightly ambushed on Channel 4 News in a way. I do feel Chimamanda could have quite ably said, well, actually, I've never been transgender.
Can we just, for those who didn't see it, can you just say what happened?
So Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who I love, and so I was really bummed out when this all went down. Chimamanda was on Channel 4 News in the UK, and kind of seemingly out of nowhere, the news presenter just sort of said, oh, and sort of, what do you make of trans women? And Chimamanda did look quite startled by this question and kind of fumbled her way through an answer about, yes, they are women, and I respect the rights to call themselves women, but have had different experiences. And of course, that she was met with claims of being transphobic. That, to me, is slightly different to Germaine Greer, who since the early 90s has been writing about how we're ghastly rapists who want to fuck our own mums. That's different. I mean, we're talking a world of difference there. I mean, Greer has burnt all her second chances. She's done about 70,000 second chances. She's made her views on trans women abundantly clear. In terms of this divide in feminism, I just don't think it exists. And this is, the problem is, and I can't speak for German TV, but in British TV, there is this gross obsession with debates and balance. And, you know, you can't have a single television show without having somebody from diametrically opposed, but often very unbalanced people sat with each other on a sofa having a barney at each other. And it's such a depressing state of it's not news. And yet somehow, oh, we couldn't possibly have a trans woman on without also having somebody on who wants to lynch trans women. And apparently that's the way we do television now. The thing is, the person who never speaks and the person they never get to sit on that sofa is the tens of millions of thousands of feminists who fully accept trans women as women. Then they're not on the settee because that doesn't make good television. Thanks. I didn't expect a clap, but it's lovely. And I think, you know, that's the voice that's kind of missing. And what was really phenomenally fantastic this week is a very small minority of British feminists who've put together this like touring roadshow talking about why they wish to exclude trans women from all women's spaces. They tried to book an event in Ireland, and some 2,000 Irish feminists have signed a petition saying, fuck off. You know, trans women have been a massive part of our repeal campaign in order to try get abortion laws passed through in Ireland. And so now we are fucking coming to support our trans sisters. And you are not coming to Ireland to create division between what is a very harmonious feminist community between trans women and non-trans women. And that was a glorious moment because it's those voices that we're not hearing. And so when people ask me about this debate, I'm like, well, actually, there kind of isn't one because we're ignoring a huge third part of this conversation, which is pro-trans feminists. And I think, you know, I'm a feminist, you know, and I don't understand why a very small group of anti-trans voices get to claim the word feminist away from the thousands of feminists who fully accept that, you know, trans rights are women's rights, black rights are women's rights, you know, these disabled rights are women's rights, and it's all part of one conversation.
Just to play devil's advocate here, I think this social media has made this whole debate much more toxic and hostile. And I certainly know one or two female journalists, Suzanne Moore, for instance, who wrote, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but who wrote about this debate some years ago. And she says, I have no idea, that she was trolled very, very badly online by some extremely hostile members of the trans community. And I think that made it so, I mean, that's where a lot of this comes from. And then, of course, you know, you're quite right, and I work, you know, in the BBC, so I know absolutely that it will always be, let's have a debate, and let's get somebody really extreme because they'll make better radio, you know, and I do think that's unfortunate, actually, because it means you don't have an intelligent conversation. But it didn't just come from there. It did genuinely come from some, I think, pretty unpleasant members of the trans community as well, attacking some, you know, well, I mean, Germaine Greer is indefensible, I agree, you know, but it came from both sides as well.
Yeah.
And the argument from some female journalists is that those members of the trans community took on quite aggressive male characteristics, which, you know, that they were arguing in a male way.
I think that's garbage. I think last week in the UK, we had a group of women who raised £19,000 on a crowdfunder to try and exclude trans women from all women lists at the Labour Party. This is women who paid money to try and exclude other women. This is a highly organised, bigoted campaign to, you know, organised by some quite highfalutin people, quite high up in the press. And, you know, when we're looking at privilege, I would fucking love to know what the privileged trans people have. Oh, it'll be all those trans people running newspapers. Oh, no, wait, they don't exist. Oh, it must be all those trans politicians. Oh, no, wait, they don't exist either. What about the trans leaders of business? Oh, no, they're not a real thing either. You know, it's not there. And the thing is, and this is why it's so important that I stress, I'm just a Juno. I am not Juno, goddess of the trans people. Because here's the thing, you know, going back to the original argument about male privilege, we all know that privilege is a somewhat complex thing based on many, many levels of fact about your culture, your religion, your skin, your socio-economic background. A really important person in my life was a girl called Charlie. I met her when she was 14 in year 9. She started high school as a girl, although for much of primary school there'd been conversations about her gender, but it was decided as far as anybody at her high school knew, Charlie was a girl and had always been a girl. And that was how she moved through high school. Please tell me what male privilege that girl got. At 11 years old, she was sexually harassed in a way that any teenage girl would be. She was catcalled from vans in her school uniform. She was groped through school. You know, she's been a fully fledged girl since the age of 11. That's not talked about. There is no one way to have male privilege. There is no one way to be a girl. There is no one way to be a trans woman. So trying to apply a one-size-fits-all method to everybody in my community is bigotry. And plain and simple, you can't say an entire section of society are uniform. You just can't. And that's where all these arguments surrounding the controversy fall apart. And that's why I would say there isn't a controversy. You know, this morning, my life has been about talking here, just making sure my dog's being walked back home. Those cold scrambled eggs were a big and very important part of my day. The concerns about my dicky tummy have been a concern of my day. There is only a controversy if we keep playing one out.
No, yeah.
I suppose I'm playing devil's advocate as well, but the issue of gender-free changing rooms, for example. So I do think there is a controversy. It is there. It does exist. So the women, say some of the feminists, some of the old school feminists who are out there would say, and they're lesbians, so they're lesbian, radical feminists, separatists, all those things together, who I think have felt perhaps the most vilified in the society. Some of them, from what I hear, are now feeling that somebody who had the privileges of being, as they would see it, of being a man, growing up as a male, is now become trans female and is now telling them that they can go into women's changing rooms. So I think that, these are some of the issues that are concerning people at the moment. I think it's very interesting. I don't know where I stand with it. You're looking at me. I don't know where I stand with this at the moment, but I do think it's like new territory for all of us. Yeah. So gender neutral toilets, we understand, right? Because often you will have male, female, and gender neutral. But a gender-free changing room, I know that I'm not sure how I feel about that.
Yeah.
I just don't see any issue with it. I can't see how particularly growing up trans, which I don't want to project any sort of understanding of your experience. I imagine it is really fucking hard. There is no privilege in that, in having to move through the world in a way that you don't feel comfortable. And as Juno said, as soon as she transitioned, she then experienced all the things that women do. Shit Tinder people, crappy dates, people offering you money for sex, all of those sorts of things. I just don't see it as a valid argument, And if it is a valid argument, I think it is us who need to make that change, There needs to be a conversation where we try and understand, rather than just saying that's off limits for you.
I think at the moment it's very explosive, and people sometimes feel they're sort of treading on eggshells. So I think once that dies down, as I think I said earlier, perhaps people can sit and have just logical, reasonable discussions and kind of thrash these things out.
I wonder if I think it's quite generational though, isn't it? Because I'm 55. I have a 20-year-old son, and I remember when he was about 15. I got a letter from his school. I mean, we live in West London, so it's a fairly liberal area. And the letter from the school explained that 2 people in his year, next year, one of the girls would be identifying as a boy, and this is what her name would be, and there was a boy who would be identifying as a girl. And I remember, I was like, ooh, this is really interesting. And my husband talked to a couple of other mothers, like, whoa, are they too young? Are they, So then I discuss it with my son, like, do you know these two? And he goes, yeah. I'm like, and what do you think? Don't know. I mean, it's fine, really, isn't it? If that's what they want to be, doesn't matter. And I noticed the other day he came back from university, and he turned up with a group of friends one night, and introduced them. And one of them is a trans boy who's transitioning to. And my son had never mentioned it to me. Now, in my generation, I would have gone, oh yes, I've got a friend who's transitioning. He didn't think it was interesting. So I think there's partly that, and then I think also just sort of one of the terms I wanted to discuss today was the new term feminazi. And you and I have spoken about this. We were involved in feminism in the 80s, and we in the 70s and 80s, and we really thought we were going to change the world. And then we lived through a backlash. We lived through a huge backlash in the 90s of lad culture, of women sort of saying feminism. I'm not a feminist, as though it was a dirty word. And I know that part of me with the Me Too campaign and all this, I'm thinking, oh, this is great, but will there be a backlash? And when the word feminazi comes up, it fills me with fear. And I think perhaps the whole sort of, divide and rule between the trans community and the feminism community, I think an element of that is happening as well. That's possibly where some of our confusion, because I feel confused by it as well. I'm not sure what's right, and I've seen us take steps forward as women and be forced back. And so I think that's probably why it's all so sensitive as well.
I think also that feminism in 2017 has become commercialized, commodified, monetized. So, you know, they're selling these I'm a feminist t-shirts, designer t-shirts for $700. You know, everybody is now a feminist, or the models, the top models are feminists and so on. So on the one hand, we can look at all the grassroots activities that are happening, which I think are incredible, driven, I would say, probably by young feminists. And on the other hand, we've got the business, basically, is kind of coming in and exploiting it. And then we've got the very volatile arguments that are happening and some of the divisions that are happening. And then you're kind of wondering where it's going to go. And as Kirsty said, we've been there. Last time it wasn't commercialized. So last time feminism was underground. You were an outsider, you were marginalized. Now it's fine to say you're a feminist and nobody's going to bat an eyelid, I would suggest, in most countries, well, certainly in England. So it's a very interesting time, but it's also a very worrying time, because you can see how you think you've made, you know, it's also in terms of race, I consider myself an intersectional feminist, in that I'm, you know, my background, the fact that I'm a black woman, the fact that originally I was a working class woman, you know, that also plays into how I see my identity and how I respond to the world as a feminist. But we've seen how we've made all these gains, you know, we have, because feminism is responsible for, you know, us moving towards equality as women. And then we saw the backlash, and then we saw the fact that, you know, it was embarrassing to be called a feminist. Now we see this new movement. We see new young feminists emerging who aren't aware of the history, which I find particularly interesting. I reviewed a book not so long ago where the writer seemed to think that black feminists in Britain emerged in 2012 when she graduated from university. And she knew a lot about the African American feminists, Alice Walker, Audre Lorde, you know, Angela Davis, but knew nothing about the British history. So that makes me feel incredibly historical, that I'm thinking, oh my God, this is happening in my lifetime. And that, you know, perhaps you can't Google everything that happened, you know, 15 years ago, but you need to go out there and do some research and find out what happened in the archives and so on. So somebody said to me, well, if you can't Google it, they don't think it existed. So that's why they don't know, because all the research is done online. So anyway, I think it's very fertile grounds as a writer, fertile grounds for all of us.
Yeah, I want to bring it back to literature, actually, and Nick, and ask you, is because, you know, we've had the discussion about the lexicon and the new words, but actually this is really great fertile territory, isn't it, for writing? I mean, you know, in Juno's point earlier today about how she personifies gender, and I thought, oh, that's sort of, you know, interesting. I mean, does this give us? Is this liberating, do you think, in terms of being able to explore these ideas of gender? I mean, for you as a poet, exploring ideas of masculinity, do you think you're freer to do that now?
I think we've always been free to do it. Whether it's accepted is another thing, because we're all here. I mean, I make a living as a writer. That's what I do. So and I think, you know, what you're saying about being on the crest of a wave, it was all about timing. What I would like to see in the future is that stories from different parts of our society can be told and not be just cast aside. And I think what you're saying about the publishing industry, I think the changes are happening too slowly. So we can tell the stories. The story's already being told. That's the funny thing. And you know, there's stories that are really interesting that are being told that aren't getting shown the light of day. They're being dismissed on slush piles. They're just being dismissed just because of who people know. So, but on the flip side of that, I would encourage, you know, probably in this crowd or people listening on the feed, if you are from those stories that have not been heard, you should still write them. You know, because all the stuff that we've been listening today are from people you would not expect to hear those stories from. Like, you know, I was talking to you yesterday, and I was saying, I mean, she writes novels, but she writes like a poet. You know, that first scene of the birth of a child, which in many ways we've all experienced, or at least been a part of. You know, I hope no aliens in here, but yeah, that taking it just as you say, like the writing from a woman's perspective, which we don't get to see enough of. If women can only be, like, as they say, the Madonnas or the whores, but then what you did, you totally flipped that, and you're telling from a woman's perspective as the birth of a child, and that totally sends it out of that paradigm. And I thought that, to me, was the genius. So I was sitting there and I was like, this is flipping genius, because what she's doing is setting up the argument, the way forward. And I think literature holds the key. It's not something that belongs to this white elite, as you were saying. It belongs to the communities that we're from, and that's how you hold culture. I don't want to lose my culture because nobody wants to tell my story, so I'm going to tell my story. Now
look, I'm going to open it up for the audience in a minute, but actually, we talked about you reading a poem before so get your questions ready, and Nick's going to read us a short poem, and if you could just introduce it as well.
Just seeing as it's with gender, it has the word man in it, so the poem is called, see what I did there? Resurrection Man. I'll share it with you. Somewhere west of our sacred sites, the ghost of your former self is rising from captivity. Your student friend, the one that saw you last, swears she left you alive on the taxi, even after my two-fisted punches. She denies being the one who gave the signal for dark men to change their shapes in the night as you knelt blindfolded. I want to believe she had no part in the shaving of your hair and pubic mound in front of onlookers, rebels kneading your breasts like posho in the palms of their palms, begging for you in turn, for your body, bleached by the Jeep's headlights. Once broken, you were dragged by the arms across the grass onto an unpaved taxiway of Aurora Airport. Then one yelled, "Burn her, the witch." Their echoes agreed. One lit the match, another peeled the blindfold, the rest poured gin on your face. I know you saw me in the hollow of a tree. I wanted to run to you, but their bullets would have easily caught up with me. I stood firm, learning to hide myself in the dark. A man must have two faces, one he can live with and one he will die with. The second face is mine.
Very powerful. We got some questions from the audience. Guy at the back with the red sweater.
Hi. I was having a conversation outside during lunch, and I wanted to ask this question to Juno, actually, but it's good that everybody's together. You mentioned that gender fucks children, basically. And I do believe that, too, and I believe it also fucks adults up, basically. And Bernadine was also outside. I mean, we're talking about the many names to classify gender. Gay, lesbian, trans, cis, non-binary. And I was thinking about the importance of it, but also what it does against us. It does describe how one feels, how one behaves next to other people, either sexually, emotionally, or mentally. But at one point, it also brought me to thinking that the more we classify gender, the more we make our minorities even smaller. It almost as if it sets us further apart. And instead of working as a community, we work at smaller, weaker groups. So I wonder where gender is taking us. Are we going to end up stretching it so much that it will break, or will it break us? I don't know.
That's such a good question. I love it. You should write a book about that. And I will read it. I think, I mean, the line in the book about gender fucks kids, I think that's because, again, it's the system we're in. And I think, to be honest, we've not said it as much as I thought we might, to be honest. The word patriarchy, I mean, that's what it is. When we talk about rape culture as well, I really think that's another word for patriarchy, to be honest. Just a system that benefits straight, white, cisgender men. And when I say gender fucks kids, really what I'm getting at is the fact that whether we like it or not, really wherever we are in the world, I think there's one place in Kenya that's a matriarchy. But except for that place, the rest of us are born into this patriarchy, and those are the rules we have to deal with, regardless of how we're born. We're dealing with all the things, we've talked about with that girls and women are subjected to, but then also the flip side of that, the fact that men are dealing with this incredible, and I'm very pleased that the concept of toxic masculinity has kind of gone mainstream. And I think when we discuss toxic masculinity, we all now have a concept of what that is, kind of like the most masculine masculinity to the detriment of being a boy, kind of, and to the detriment of human emotion and kindness and gentleness, and those things that men are seemingly meant to eradicate. But in terms of the second point about sort of subdividing ourselves down into smaller and smaller and smaller minorities, I think, weirdly, sometimes I think conversations about privilege are quite privileged. And I think actually for the vast majority of people around the world, it's just men and women. And it will always be just men and women. And with the exception of intersex people, by and large, our sex is very different to our gender, and our sex is pretty much binary. And so I think we're never going to deviate. In a massive mainstream way, I don't think really we're going to move much beyond men and women. And that's why I think it's so important that trans women are included as women. And I think if that's the mantra that I think is that bears repeating, which is trans men are men, trans women are women. And that's probably how I would like us to operate moving forward.
Can I just I'll take another, and I want to follow up on that with another question, but I'm going to give it to the floor. Just so this gentleman here with the hat in the fourth row.
Hi. It doesn't directly follow on from that question, though. I just wanted to ask the question about, well, firstly, just wanted to commend all the amazing writers that shared a lot of their work with us thus far. So I just wanted to ask about where masculinity sits in all of this, because I know you guys have explored your truths and your experiences through your writing, in which case most of the men have been depicted in the ways that you guys experience them, but also the idea of where masculinity sits with this across the spectrum, because I know you were talking earlier about some masculine characteristics are not shown, like guilt is something that is usually female, or anger being masculine, which are, again, to me, are conditioned ideas, because where does the literature and the work that you guys have holds the power to also challenge that dynamic of the fluidity of what masculinity means, and actually teach that from educational perspective to the younger generation? Because actually, the question is, where does that sit in the work that you do? Is there a lot of cognizance about that in the work that you guys put out, as well as trying to redress the balance of what idea of masculinity is already out there?
I'll pass that to Nick, because I've never really done boy characters.
Been a boy all my life. Okay. So I think, the hard conversation to admit, I would say, I'm comfortable saying this, is that the definition that we have of man right now isn't an accurate definition. It doesn't hold what I would like manhood to hold. So I don't want to, I don't want my son waking up, seeing Trump and thinking that that's how he needs to be, or that is an acceptable way of being, or seeing Harvey Weinstein and thinking that that's how you can treat women, men, whether it's gender we're looking at or whether it's sex we're looking at. What I want is a larger set. I want to have a larger set of emotions, and I want to have a different types of dialogue. The fact that we're in this dialogue is the problem showing itself. I think we've lived long enough with it underground, and I'm actually quite happy that this is, I'm not happy at what's happened to America or even what's happened to us back home, but in many ways it had to happen, because it was, women were having this conversation and they were being ignored. They were saying, man, men can't treat us this way, and then all of a sudden they're like, but it's okay. Say Harvey Weinstein, oh my God, why are men treating women this way? Now, do you understand what I'm saying? So I think what we have to do, we have to open out what the definition of man should actually be, and it requires nuance. What is real strength? What does that look like? What is compassion? What does that look like? If this is privilege, why is privilege being set up? What am I gaining by having women be low? And until we have those conversations, everything else is just smoke and mirrors. I find, and I think there are good men that is possible, but even then we are flawed, and it's okay to be flawed, but we have to accept those flaws instead of kind of living in this, I'm being attacked, you don't understand me, which is easy. It's a human instinct to put up a reflex. So I get that, being a scientist,
Can I just say, it's also about expanding the definition of being a woman. Exactly. We need to look at. So, for example, if you look at the way we're sitting here, do you notice anything? So why am I not comfortable? I would be really comfortable sitting like this. I really would, or like this. Why am I not sitting like this? So I'll leave that with you.
I know why I'm not sitting like that, because I have a skirt on, but anyway.
Say to the gentleman who just asked a question, and it's a small movement, but it's a significant movement. There is such a thing as a men's movement, which was started by a poet, Robert Bly, in America, and there's an organisation in the UK called the Mankind Project. I think they do fantastic work with men, and you're talking about a few thousand, not tens of thousands like needed. And so I just want to lob that in, because there are people thinking about masculinity, working with men, working to address, and they do things like hug trees and warrior stuff, but it's not, I think this is work going in the right direction around masculinity. And then also something about the pre-monotheist, at the time when the axial age and religion was popping up all over the world. Prior to that, there was goddess worship. We were worshipping the redemption of the cycles of the seasons and resurrection, and we were seeing, that the entire humanity drops from between the legs of a woman, etc., etc. And we've lost the goddess. We have lost the feminine. And call me an old hippie, but we are living with this problem, with this imbalance. We've lost it. So that's my bit.
I'm also conscious of, raising a son in the age of internet pornography, how incredibly difficult that is for young men growing up when these images are so easily accessible. And I remember when my son was sort of reaching puberty, watching a fascinating documentary about sex education in Holland, and watching these young kids being taught basically that you shouldn't you should have sex in a loving relationship. They were teaching them about love, actually. And Juno, you're an ex-teacher. You know about this, and I think that's one of the things that we need to, if we're going to redefine relationships between men and women, we need to teach our children about sex and love together.
And yeah, I think in the UK, we call it SRE, which is sex and relationship education. And the problem is we do sex education okay, in that, again, if you want to know how a baby is made, how a baby is born, and how to use a condom, we're doing that quite well, actually. The vast majority of state schools, I should stress. It's the R that we're terrible at. We're not doing the relationship education. And I think it would make such a difference, because within that, so my big thing, and it's, I've been criticised for it, is drop a maths lesson, one a week. Just get rid, I still believe in maths, but, I question maths. I'm maths questioning. I drop one maths lesson a week and do this relationship. Do your proper SRE. And within that, you could teach about consent, and you could teach about pornography, and you could teach about how to dump someone, which I think would be really good, how to ask someone out in a non-creepy way, how to negotiate. We see kids getting themselves into huge issues with swapping nudes It's become so expected that both girls and boys will share pornographic images of themselves. And I mean, and every day I'm so grateful that I don't think any of us grew up in the smartphone generation. And I'm like, hallelujah, because, you know, it's made life so much more complex than I think we can even recognize. And we need to teach these things, because otherwise they will go online. And the stuff online is just so unreliable. Go on, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, one more thing with that is that, you know, one of the things that companies look for when they're working and they want to hire you is emotional intelligence, yet we don't teach it. And if you had emotional intelligence in all these things that we're talking about, gender, the people would treat each other differently. And so you walk into an office, they want you to have something that is not being, you spend most of your life in education, but it's not being taught there. In fact, it's being, it's being dismissed. And then you wonder why we're bringing out a generation of people who are either angry or insecure or feel under pressure. It's actually, what you're saying is quite important. Yeah, I totally agree with that.
But there's a question from the front. I don't know who it's for yet.
Thank you. Yes, there's one eminent person in the UK, and it's Grayson Perry, Turner Prize winner and also Chancellor of the University of the Arts. And he's recently written this book, The Descent of Man. And this is about relationships and teaching how to change and improve relationships. And it's very much about a movement, a kind of new masculinity that he's teaching. It's a masculinity which is more caring, more feminine in a way, and it's a fascinating book. And Bernie, I think you recommended this as a reading for us to prepare the seminar. And it really, I think, if this was read all over schools, for example, this would change the world quite considerably.
Okay. Oh, lots of hands going up. Yep. We'll come to all of you.
So. Following up, my question also has to do with this masculinity, because I'm Brazilian, so I come from South America, very sexist country, and I have so many male cis friends. And how do we bring these people to the debate? Because they're really, even though, most are Brazilians, but some are Europeans, they even consider themselves feminists, but they're really not. I mean, they fuck with women a lot. Like fuck in the head, not in the, in the other sense. Yeah, well, that too, but anyway, and my question is also, because I call myself a feminist as well, and in the Ansari story, for example, that I was very happy that you brought it up, that when I read the article of the girl, and I was like, is this abuse? I mean, I was confused, I was in doubt, because, that happened to me so many times. It's just like, no, it's not that bad, it's like, oh. So there was no violence, there was no, I don't know, if you think about Harvey Weinstein, and I read the articles, and I was like, oh my God, this guy's creepy, Jesus. But when you think about like a kind of cute guy, and put your hand in his dick all the time, it's like, okay, this is normal, And I was like, this is not abuse, and I'm a feminist. And imagine, so how do you explain to the male friends who have this privilege, and they don't see themselves also as, I don't know, also rapists in a way. How do you bring these people to the debate and change this dynamic of, straight couples in a way? Because, it's like, it's a bit exhausting.
Can I just say something?
Yes, go ahead.
I don't have a full answer, but there are a few things you have to understand. I mean, you said something yesterday, you used the word code switching. And, when you are the majority and you're doing something that is unfair, you don't need to notice it. But you're asking, how do we make them notice it? Now the tool is there, but the tool is deadly. It's the internet. The internet is it's the thing that connects everyone. Something can be happening right now in Japan. I get it on my Facebook and it's there. But what it does is that how we report on it polarizes us. So right now, we are in the age of the internet, and we are being polarized in our views. Right now, everyone here has their own personal view. You go on your likes. Every time you do that thing, you're talking about swipe right, swipe left. As soon as you do a like, you're polarizing your view. I like these kind of people. I like these kind of people. Oh, these are my people. Oh, you're not my people. You're not my people. So actually, this thing that can actually help, the way that we put information out, we have to be a lot more responsible. So for me, I mean, I'm learning the hard way. I'm learning through my daughter and my wife that I have to be more responsible, even in things to me that seem trivial. You know, so, you know, I wake up in the morning, I'm like, come on, everyone, get out of bed. I'm shouting. But to me, I'm just like, come on, hurry up. But they are perceiving me as a threat. So it's small. People probably have that every day. But it's a subtle change in behavior that I have power to adjust. Yeah, whereas a woman has to experience that all the time. Men can shout all the time. What's going on here? Oh, we're drunk. We're just being drunk. Don't be. Oh, she's on her period. I can say that. I have to wait. What about? Wait. It's an adjustment. I mean, I'll just accuse her of her mood just because. Yeah, I'm using an example. That's okay. Just an example. I'm a horrible man. But I don't know if I'm answering the question. But I'm saying that there are small adjustments in behavior that allow the conversation to extend itself and also give women their rightful permissions. Because right now women have permissions that they're not using because we don't allow them.
But is this so? Just to clarify that, is that men who have to modify their behaviour, or in answer to the question? So, you know, take the example of Brazil, and you know, I've been to Brazil many times. It's quite a macho culture. So I mean, so if you're a young Brazilian woman and a cute guy approaches you in a bar and is a little bit entitled, who needs to have the conversation? I mean, who needs to change their behaviour? Does the woman also need to perhaps be more assertive about her needs and how she wants to be treated, or is it up to the man to change his behaviour? Both.
Well, somebody has to take the lead. I think where the economic power is where the change has to be made. You know, how do you if you're the one not getting what you want and I'm in the dominant position, how am I supposed to ask? Could you move your hand as I step all over it? You know. Doesn't make sense. So I'm not saying that all men are like that, but what I'm saying is that these polarizing parts of society that are constantly happening, we think that they're new. It's almost like the Black Lives Matter. That stuff's been happening all the time. All the internet has done is just make us aware of it. So what women are experiencing and, you know, all these kind of isms, they've been happening all the time. So these adjustments have to be made, and we have to see them in noticeable places. Yeah.
Can I just add to that, when the Me Too movement was happening, which I thought was, I know some people find it complicated for many reasons, I found it fucking amazing. I was watching my students who I teach who are 17 and 18 talking about issues of consent and boundaries in a way that I had no idea. I just wouldn't have had any idea of at that age, and I thought it was incredible to see them speaking openly and powerfully about what they'd experienced. But that was not for women. No woman did not know that we'd been being harassed every single day, or had walked home frightened of being raped, or had, you know, been sexually harassed in a myriad of different ways from the minute we became, you know, sort of sexual beings in the eyes of society. That was for men. That was so that men, and actually what I saw was men being like, oh, this is happening. And like they knew too, but I think Me Too allowed them to start a dialogue about it and start really like analyzing their own behavior instead of just going with the status quo all the time. Is this okay? If it's not okay, how can I speak with a woman to try and change the way in which I'm interacting? So I feel like, yeah, I totally agree with you. The internet is the way to go because it's reaching everyone and starting that dialogue.
So there was some more hands up there. Yes, so gentleman here in the sort of 7th row, and then I know that somebody at the back, you next.
Hello. I just wanted to share a very quick observation about life in Berlin. So in Germany, most of you probably know this, but there's this big sauna culture where men and women share the sauna together and everyone's naked together in the sauna. And they also change together in the same changing room. And I've done this quite a few times now, and I've noticed that it has this very, well, for a start, you quickly become immune to being naked. You forget about your own nakedness, you forget about the nakedness of people of the opposite sex, people of the same sex, or whatever. And it has this very kind of like equalizing effect, where in a way sometimes, obviously maybe the steam and the fumes kind of make you quite giddy in the head, but it has this effect that you can sometimes forget or not even notice who is a man and who is a woman. We're all just, because we're devoid of our clothes and the normal trappings of our gender, we kind of just merge into the, we're all just mutual people with flesh and bodies and all the rest of it. So yeah, I guess I'd recommend that you give that a go before you leave Berlin, or if you live in Berlin. And sorry, I'll ask an actual question now as well. About Me Too, I was just wondering if you, plural, think that during that there was a place for men who themselves had been sexually harassed or assaulted to share their own stories, or if you think that would have been to have intruded on an issue that essentially belonged to women.
Oh God, I wish I hadn't taken the mic off Kerry now, God. I mean, regarding single-sex spaces, I can think of literally nothing worse than being naked in a public place. Like, it's like that nightmare you have when you're a child, isn't it? And you're in an exam room and you're naked, and then your mum's there. And I can't think of anything else. So, but each to their own. You enjoy that sauna. Regarding the Me Too thing, it's funny because I had one of the weird trans experiences I've had was that I did have maybe 7 years on the gay scene in Brighton and London, and did find it to be dodgy regarding consent, regarding especially groping. I would say endemic levels of groping on the gay scene, often with older, this was again purely my experience, I'm not speaking for the whole community, older gay men groping younger gay men in a very kind of like, oh, it's fresh meat, ooh, kind of way. And it wasn't great. And I think yeah, there's absolutely needs to be a conversation about.
I mean, Kevin Spacey came out.
And actually, a really good point. Yeah, that actually in the wash that followed Me Too, Kevin Spacey very quickly came out in the wash, which was an interesting because talk about a code of silence. I was well aware of Kevin Spacey's behaviour for years and didn't say anything. And do you know what it is? I think as well because there weren't women involved, we were quicker to turn a blind eye because we didn't so much see his male victims as victims. And maybe that's actually why it's a really important conversation to be had. And that is, again, that exists because of patriarchy. We don't think men can be weak or vulnerable.
Now, I'm aware that we've only got 5 minutes left. We had some hands up. So I'm going to take 2 comments, one from the back and one from the front row, and I'll take them one after the other. Bernadine.
Picking up on what Bernadine was saying, sorry, about the importance of of having a rational discussion. I think there's also an importance of seeing that there are other factors often in play when discussions take place. And going back to the very basic thing about lavatories and changing rooms, I think what seems like it could be an easy solution is actually a really difficult one if you're dealing with the economics of making that work. That if you are an organization, if you're a building designer, you're trying to provide what would solve it, which is essentially safe individual spaces, whether they are for changing or whatever. What can seem slow and frustrating and can also drive what looks like a resistance to that kind of thing, it can actually be based on fundamental economics of the cost of doing that, the space that it involves, the cost of doing it. And I think sometimes we need to unpick that there are other arguments, there are other things going on in what look like either prejudiced or resistant discussions, that if we could see those other factors, then we might have more normal and more balanced discussions about whether things are possible or not, and when we can get to the point of, I mean, ideally everybody would have a private space, whatever gender, that wasn't gender specific in any way, but the things that are slowing it down can look like negativity and resistance and prejudice, I think, when sometimes they're not.
But I think just hold off for a moment because I want to get one more comment from the front row, just so because we're going to wrap up in a moment. So and then we can answer the both together.
All right. I just wanted to say my view is that cultures are like machines that reproduce themselves. That's what they're designed to do, and that's what happens to us in cultures. So I was very sympathetic to Juno and also Nick saying, men can change, cisgender men need to change. But the question is, how do we induce that change? How do we get them to change? The example of parenting makes sense, but that's on an individual level. But what we're really talking about here, what you've been talking about, is cultural change. And so how do we induce that? And the question, of course, of the panel on one level is, what can literature contribute to do that? And of course, that is a mechanism that gets, large readership, etc. But do you as writers feel comfortable with that? Do you think your books can, induce cultural change and sort of stall that machine that leads to, male predators and, rejig the machine, reset? Is, I think, what you said earlier, we need a reset. Can literature do that? And do we want it to do that?
Shall I do the lose first? Yeah, do the lose. I think the thing is, I'm not sure trans people, again, not speaking for the whole community, I'm not sure trans people are calling for individual toilet pods. Although increasingly, I know a lot of chain restaurants do that. And of course, if you've used an aeroplane, you have used a non-gendered toilet. But I think, again, sometimes it detracts from, again, going back to that sort of very basic mantra of trans women are women. So we use the women's toilet. I think, and that's really what it boils down to. I had a really nice conversation a couple of weeks ago with Caitlin Moran, and I asked her why her feminism is fully inclusive of trans people. And she was like, because there's not been a problem. And I was like, eh? And she was like, well, there hasn't. A trans woman has never attacked another woman in a toilet, has she? And I was like, oh, actually, no. It's never happened in recorded history. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm sure all sorts of terrible things have happened in all sorts of terrible places, but there is no record. And Caitlin was like, well, if it's not a problem, why are we making it a problem? And I was like, oh, yeah. And that's about as much as I have on it, really. Regarding the second bit, well, I've got the microphone. Regarding the second bit, I think, certainly as a writer, I think sometimes you can either present reality as you would like it to be, or you can present reality as it is. And I think two of my YA colleagues, you've got David Levithan, the wonderful American writer, who has always written LGBT characters as it could be. Almost like a beautiful utopia where everybody is accepted, everybody gets along, everybody's equally valid and equally good. And then you've got Patrick Ness, who is gritty and represents the world as it is, with all its homophobia and transphobia and misogyny and racism. And he examined all of those things so well in his various YA books. And so I think it's up to the writer. I think we are creatives and we should be able to write the books we want to write.
Yeah, I think also this machine you're talking about, you said at the home, I think the home is the base unit, but there are many changes that need to be made. So it's how we work in companies, how we work in the way that we build when women and men commute to work. How do you make it that a woman can feel safe going to work? It's a simple thing, but it's a magnificent thing. So, I mean, an example of that is, my director's in I'm doing a play with Fuel, and my director insists on, he's a male director, black male director, but he insists on, I don't care what decision we make, there always has to be a woman in the room. Yeah? So that woman can say, that's bollocks, that's not how it's supposed to be, because we don't know as men what we're sensitizing out. And so when he said that, from now on, even when I'm like, don't know, but I'll call up a woman, if there's just to have their opinion in the room. And I think that's part of the problem. In our culture, we erase women from many conversations, And also it is to what's clear to me from this Harvey Weinstein situation is that whether we like it or not, whatever gender you are, women do not feel safe. And we have to take responsibility for that. We can't just pretend, well, I'm safe. Why don't you feel safe? You're not me, you idiot. So I don't know if that's helping, but...
No, I think it's my husband, who sits on a lot of panels, a couple of years ago, just all male panels, he kept on being about, he just now goes, okay, who else is on the panel? You haven't got a woman, I'm not taking part. And actually, if more men did that, it would make a difference. But anyway, we could go on all afternoon. It's been a fantastic discussion, and I think what we've proved is that places like this, words, literature, provide a safe and empathetic space in which to have these kind of conversations, which can often be difficult, but which are very important. And I'd like to thank all my panelists for great contributions. Thank you very much.